Welcome, Velikovsky's Earth and Upheaval. Very good information here you're gonna like. Let's get into it. Chapter 6. Mountain Thrusts in the Alps and elsewhere. The age of a rock formation is ascertained with the help of fossils it contains. To the surprise of many scientists, it was found that the mountains had traveled since older formations have been pushed over on top of younger ones. Chief Mountain in Montana is a massive standing several thousand feet above the Great Plains. It has been thrust bodily upon the much younger strata of the Great Plains, and then driven over them eastward for a distance of at least 8 miles. Indeed, the thrust may have been several times 8 miles, writes Daly. By similar thrusting, the whole Rocky Mountain front for hundreds of miles has been pushed up and then out many miles over the plains. Such titanic displacements of mountains have been found in many places on the earth. The displacement of the Alps is especially extensive. During the building of the Alps, gigantic slabs of rock, thousands of feet thick, hundreds of miles long, and tens of miles wide, were thrust up and then over, relatively to the rocks beneath. The direction of the relative overthrusting movement was from Africa toward the main mass of Europe on the north. The visible rocks of the northern Alps of Switzerland have thus been shoved northward distances of the order of 100 miles. In a sense, the Alps used to be on the present site of northern Italy. Mount Blanc was moved from its place and the Matterhorn was overturned. These portions of the Alps that surround the valley of the Linth in the canton of Glarus in Switzerland have lower parts of the tertiary formations or of the age of mammals. Their upper parts are Permian, preceding the age of reptiles, and Jurassic, the age of reptiles. This impels to one of two conclusions. Either the division of rocks into sequences based on fossils they contain is fallacious, or the old mountains were moved bodily and set on the shoulders of more recent formations. The latter conclusion is chosen, and if de Sauzier's notion of the sea sweeping over the Alps appeared fantastic, the idea of mountains traveling considerable distances must sound even more fantastic, unless we know of a physical cause that could have brought it about, but even the very cause of mountain building itself is obscure. The problem of mountain making is a vexing one. Many of them, mountains, are composed of tangentially compressed and overthrust rocks that indicate scores of miles of circumferential shortening in the Earth's crust. Radial shrinkage is woefully inadequate to cause the observed amount of horizontal compression. Therein lies the real perplexity of the problem of mountain making. Geologists have not yet found a satisfactory escape from this dilemma, says F.K. Mather of Harvard University. The origin of the mountains is not explained, and still less is their thrust or shift across valleys and over other mountains. The Alps were shoved 100 miles to the north. Chief Mountain in Montana traveled across the plains and climbed the slope of another mountain and settled on top of it. All of the Glacier National Park in Montana and all of the Rocky Mountain area up to Yellowhead Pass in Alberta moved for many miles. The mountains of westward Scotland shifted from their places. The entire length of the Norwegian mountains showed a similar overthrust. What could have caused these mountains to travel across valley and uphill with their masses of granite weighing billions of tons. No force acting from inside the Earth, pulling inward or pushing outward, could have created these overthrusts. Only twisting could have produced them. It could hardly have occurred if the rotation and revolution of our planet had never been disturbed. In the Alps, caverns with human artifacts of stone and bone dating from the Pleistocene Ice Age have been found at remarkably high altitudes. During the Ice Age, the slopes and valleys of the Alps, more than other parts of the continent, must have been covered by glaciers. Today in Central Europe, there are great glaciers only in the Alps. The presence of men at high altitudes during the Pleistocene or Paleolithic rude stone age seems baffling. The cavern of Wild Chile near the top of Ebenalp is 4,900 feet above sea level. It was occupied by man sometime during the Pleistocene. Even more remarkable in respect to altitude is the cavern of Drachenlach at height of 2,445 meters, 8,028 feet, near the top of Drechenberg, south of Ragaz. This is a steep, snow-covered massif. Both of these stations are in the very heart of the alpine field of glaciation. The continental ice sheet, thousands of feet thick, filled the entire valley between the Alps and the Jura, where now Lake Geneva lies, to the height of the erratic boulders torn from the Alps and placed on the Jura Mountains. In the same geological epoch, between two advances of the ice cover, during an interglacial intermission, human beings must have occupied caverns 8,000 feet above sea level. No satisfactory explanation for such location of Stone Age man has ever been offered. Could it be that the mountains rose as late as in the age of man and carried up with them the caverns of early man? In recent years, evidence has grown rapidly to show, in contrast to previous opinions, that the Alps and other mountains rose and attained their present heights, and also traveled long distances in the age of man. Mountain uplifts amounting to many thousands of feet have occurred within the Pleistocene epoch, Ice Age, itself. This occurred with the Cordilleran mountain system in both North and South America, the Alps, Caucasus, Central Asian system, and many others. The fact of the late upthrust of the major ridges of the world created, when recognized, great perplexity among geologists who, under the weight of much evidence, were forced to this view. The revision of the concepts is not always radical enough. Not only in the age of man, but in the age of historical man. Mountains were thrust up, valleys were torn out, lakes were dragged uphill and emptied. Helmut Gams and Rolf Nordhagen brought together very extensive material concerning the Bavarian Alps and the Tyrol, or Eastern Alps. We shall deal with this material in Chapter 11, Climasters. The great mountain chains challenged credulity by their extreme youth, wrote the explorer Bailey Willis in the Asian Mountains. The Himalayas. The Himalayas, highest mountains in the world, rise like a 1,000-mile-long wall north of India. This mountain wall stretches from Kashmir in the west to and beyond Bhutan in the east, with many of its peaks towering over 20,000 feet, Mount Everest reaching 29,000 feet, or over 5 miles. The summits of these lofty massifs are capped by eternal snow in those regions of the heavens where eagles do not fly, nor any other bird of the sky. Scientists of the 19th century were dismayed to find that, as high as they climbed, the rocks of the massifs yielded skeletons of marine animals. fish that swim in the ocean, and shells of mollusks. And marine animals look down to where now we look up, and where man, after many unsuccessful efforts, has until now succeeded only once in putting his feet. Until recently, it was assumed that the Himalayas rose from the bottom of the sea to their present height tens or perhaps hundreds of millions of years ago. Such a long period of time, so long ago, was enough even for the Himalayas to have risen to their present height. Do we not, when we tell young listeners the story about giants and monsters, begin with "once upon a time, long, long ago"? And the giants are no longer threatening, and the monsters are no longer real. According to the general geological scheme, 500 million years ago, the first forms of life appeared on the Earth. 200 million years ago, life developed into reptilian forms that dominated the scene, achieving gigantic size. The huge reptiles died out 70 million years ago, and mammals occupied the Earth. They belong to the Tertiary. According to this scheme, the last mountain uplifts took place at the end of the Tertiary, during the Pleistocene. This period lasted until a million years ago, when the Quaternary period, the age of man, began. The Quaternary is also the time of the Ice Age, or the Pleistocene, the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, and the very end of the Quaternary, since the end of the Ice Age, is called recent time, the Neolithic, late or polished stone, bronze and iron cultures. Since the appearance of man on Earth, or since the beginning of the Ice Age, there have been no uplifts on any substantial scale. In other words, we have been told the profile of the Earth with its mountains and oceans was already established when man first appeared. In the last few decades, however, numerous facts have emerged from mountains and valleys that tell a different story. In Kashmir, Helmut de Terra discovered sedimentary deposits of an ancient sea bottom that was elevated at places to an altitude of 5,000 feet or more, and tilted at an angle of as much as 40 degrees. The basin was dragged up by the rise of the mountain. But this was entirely unexpected. These deposits contain Paleolithic fossils, and this, according to Arnold Heim, Swiss geologist, would make it plausible that the mountain passes in the Himalayas may have risen in the age of man, 3,000 feet or more. However fantastic changes so extensively may seem to a modern geologist, studies on the Ice Age in India and associated human cultures, published in 1939 by de Terra, working for the Carnegie Institution, with the assistance of Professor T.T. Patterson of Harvard University, is one long argument and demonstration that the Himalayas were arising during the Glacial Age and reached their present heights only after the end of the Glacial Age. And actually, in historical times, from other mountain ridges came similar reports. De Terra divided the Ice Age of the Kashmir slopes of the Himalayas into Lower Pleistocene, embracing first glacial and interglacial stages, Middle Pleistocene, the second major glaciation, and the following interglacial, and the Upper Pleistocene, comprising the last two glaciations and an interglacial stage. The scenery with this region presented at the beginning of the Pleistocene must have differed greatly from that of our time. The Kashmir Valley was less elevated, and its southern rampart, the Pir Panjal, lacked that alpine grandeur that enchants the traveler today. Then various formation groups moved both horizontally and vertically, resulting in a southward displacement of older rocks upon foreland sediments accompanied by uplift of the mobile belt. The main Himalayas suffered sharp uplift, in consequence of which the Kashmir lake beds were compressed and dragged upward on the slope of the most mobile range. Uplift was accompanied by a southward shifting of the Panajal block toward the foreland of northwestern India. The Panajal massif that was pushed toward India is at present 15,000 feet high. In the beginning of this period, the fauna was greatly impoverished, but thereafter, judging from remains, large cats, elephants, true horses, pigs, and hippopotami accompanied the area. In the Middle Pleistocene, or Ice Age, there was a continued uplift. The archaeological records prove that early Paleolithic man inhabited the adjoining plains. Terra refers to abundance of Paleolithic sites. Man used stone implements of flake form like those found in the Cromer forest bed in England. Then once more the Himalayas were pushed upwards. Tilting of terraces and lacustrine beds indicates a continued uplift of the entire Himalayan tract during the last phases of the Ice Age. In the last stages of the Ice Age, when man worked stone in the mountains, he might have been living in the Bronze stage down in the valleys. It has been repeatedly admitted by various authorities, quoted subsequently in this book, that the end of the glacial epoch may have been almost contemporaneous with the time of the rise of the great cultures of antiquity of Egypt and Samaria, and it follows also of India and China. The Stone Age, in some regions, could have been contemporaneous with the Bronze Age in others. Even now there are numerous tribes in Africa, Australia, and Tierra del Fuego, the southern tip of the Americas, still living in the Stone Age, and many other regions of the modern world would have remained in the Stone Age had it not been for the importation of iron from more advanced regions. The Aborigines of Tasmania never got so far as to produce a polished Neolithic stone implement, and in fact barely entered the crudest Stone Age. This large island, south of Australia, was discovered in 1642 by Abel Tasman. The last Tasmanian died in exile in 1876, and the race became extinct. I always thought a Tasmanian was just a name. I didn't know they were humans. The more recent uplifts in the Himalayas took place also in the age of modern man. The post-glacial terrace record suggests that there was at least one prominent post-glacial advance of ice, and this, in the eyes of Terra and Patterson, is indicative of a diastrophic movement of the mountains. We must be emphatic on one particular feature, namely the dependence of Pleistocene glaciation on the diastrophic character of a mobile mountain belt. This relationship, we feel, has not been sufficiently recognized on the other glaciated regions, such as Central Asia and the Alps, where similar, if not identical, conditions are found. It had been generally assumed that loess, thin, wind-blown dust that is built into clays, is a product of a glacial age. However, in the Himalayas, Terra reported finding Neolithic or polished stone implements in loess, and commented, of importance for us is the fact that loess formation was not restricted to the glacial age, but that it continued into post-glacial times. In China and in Europe, too, the presence of polished stone artifacts in Loess prompted a similar revision. The Neolithic stage that began according to the accepted scheme at the end of the Ice Age still persisted in Europe and in many other places at the time when, in the centers of civilization, the Bronze Age was already flourishing. R. Feinserwalter, exploring the Nanga Parbat Massif in western Himalayas, 26,660 feet high, dated the Himalayan glaciation as post-glacial. In other words, the expansion of the glaciers in the Himalayas took place much closer to our time than had been previously assumed. Great uplifts of the Himalayas took place, in part, after the time designated as the Ice Age, or only a few thousand years ago. Heim investigated the mountain ranges of western China, adjacent to Tibet, and east to the Himalayas, came to the conclusion, 1930, that they had been elevated since the glacial age. The great massif of the Himalayas rose to its present height in the age of modern, actually historical, man. The highest mountains in the world were also the youngest. With their topmost peaks, the mountains have shattered the entire scheme of geology of the long, long ago. End of subchapter. The Siwalik Hills. The Siwalik Hills are in the foothills of the Himalayas, north of Delhi. They extend for several hundred miles and are 2,000 to 3,000 feet high. In the 19th century, their usually rich fossil beds drew the attention of scientists. Animal bones of species and genera, living and extinct, were found there in the most amazing profusion. Some of the animals looked as though nature had conducted an abortive experiment with them and had discarded the species as not fit for life. The carapace of a tortoise 20 feet long was found there. How could such an animal have moved on a hilly terrain? The Elephas ganesa, an elephant species found in the Siwalik Hills, had tusks about 14 feet long and over 3 feet in circumference. One author says of them, "It is a mystery how these animals ever carried them, owing to their enormous size and leverage." The Siwalik fossil beds are stocked with animals of so many and such varied species that the animal world of today seems impoverished by comparison. It looks as though all of these animals invaded the world at one time. This sudden bursting on stage of such varied population of herbivores, carnivores, rodents, and primates of the highest order of the mammals must be regarded as a most remarkable instance of rapid evolution of species, writes D.N. Wadia in his Geology of India. The hippopotamus, which generally is a climatically specialized type, Deutera, pigs, rhinoceroses, apes, oxen filled the interior of the hills almost to bursting. A.R. Wallace, who shares with Darwin the honor of being the originator of the theory of natural selection, was among the first to draw attention in terms of astonishment to the Siwalik extinction. Many of the genera that comprised a wealth of species were extinguished to the last one. Some are still represented, but only by a few species. Of nearly 30 species of elephants found in the Siwalik beds, only one species has survived in India. The sudden and widespread reduction by extinction of the Siwalik mammals is a most startling event for the geologist as well as the biologist. The great carnivores, the varied races of elephants, belonging to no less than 25 to 30 species, the numerous tribes of large and highly specialized ungulates, hoofed animals, which found such suitable habitats in the Siwalik jungles of the Pleistocene epoch, no more in an immediately succeeding age. It used to be assumed that the advent of the Ice Age killed them, but subsequently it has been recognized that great destructions took place in the age of man, much closer to our day. The older geologists thought that the Siwalik deposits were alluvial in their nature, that they were debris carried down by the torrential Himalayan streams. But it was realized that this explanation does not appear to be tenable on the ground of the remarkable homogeneity that the deposit possess, and a uniformity of lithologic composition in a multitude of isolated basins at considerable distances from one another. There must have been some agent that carried these animals and deposited them at the feet of the Himalayas, after the passage of a geological age repeated the performance. For in the Siwalik hills there are animals of more than one age, and signs of more than one destruction. There was also a movement of the ground. The disrupted part of the fold has slipped boldly over for long distances, thus thrusting the older pre-Siwalik rock of the inner ranges of the mountains over the younger rocks of the outer ranges. If the cause of these paroxysms and destruction was not local, it must have produced similar effects at the other end of the Himalayas and beyond that range. 1,300 miles from the Siwalik Hills in central Burma, the deposits cut by the Irrawaddy River may reach 10,000 feet. Two fossoriferous horizons occur in this series, separated by about 4,000 feet of sands. The upper horizon bed, characterized by mastodon, hippopotamus, and ox, is similar to one of the beds in the Siwaliks. The sediments are remarkable for the large quantities of fossil wood associated with them. Hundreds and thousands of entire trunks of silicified trees and huge logs laying in the sandstones suggest the denudation of thickly forested areas. Animals met death and extinction by the elementary forces of nature, which also uprooted forests from Kashmir to Indochina, threw sand over species and genera in the mountains, thousands of feet high. End of subchapter. That was pretty crazy. I've never heard of Siwalik. Tiwanaku in the Andes. In the Andes, at 16 degrees 22 south latitude, a megalithic city was found at an elevation of 12,500 feet, in a region where corn will not ripen. The term megalithic fits the dead city only in regard to the great size of the stones in its walls, some of which are flattened and joined with precision. It is situated in the Altiplano, the elevated plain between the western and eastern Cordilleras, not far from Lake Titicaca, the largest lake in South America and the highest navigable lake in the world, on the border of Bolivia and Peru. There is a mystery still unsolved on the plateau of Lake Titicaca, which, if stones could speak, would reveal a story of deepest interest. And how? Much of the difficulty in the solution of this mystery is caused by the nature of the region in the present day, where the enigma still defies explanation. So wrote Sir Clemens Markham in 1910. Such a region is only capable of sustaining a scanty population of hardy mountaineers and laborers. The mystery consists in the existence of ruins of a great city at the southern side of the lake, the builders being entirely unknown. The city covered a large area, built by highly skilled masons, and with the use of enormous stones. When the author of the quoted passages posed his questions to the scholarly world, Leonard Darwin, then president of the Royal Geographical Society, offered the surmise that the mountain had risen considerably after the city had been built. Is such an idea beyond the bounds of possibility? Asked Sir Clemens. Under the assumption that the Andes were once some 2,000–3,000 feet lower than they are now, maize would then ripen in the basin of Lake Titicaca, and the site of the ruins of Tiwanaku could support the necessary population. If the megalithic builders were living under these conditions, the problem is solved. If this is geologically impossible, the mystery remains unexplained. Several years ago, another authority, A. Poznansky, wrote in similar vein, "At the present time, the plateau of the Andes is inhospitable and almost sterile. With the present climate, it would not have been suitable in any period as the asylum for great human masses of the most important prehistoric center of the world. Endless agricultural terraces of the people who lived in this region in pre-Inca days can still be recognized. Today, this region is at a very great height above sea level. In remote periods, it was lower. The terraces rise to a height of about 15,000 feet, 2,500 feet above Tiwanaku, and still higher up to 18,400 feet above sea level, or to the present line of eternal snow on the Illimani. The conservative view among evolutionists and geologists is that mountain making is a slow process, observable in minute changes. Because it is a continuous process, there never could have been spontaneous upliftings on a large scale. In the case of Tiwanaku, however, the change in altitude apparently occurred after the city was built, and this could not have been the result of a slow process that required hundreds of thousands of years to produce a visible alteration. Once Tiwanaku was at the water's edge, then Lake Titicaca was 90 feet higher, as its old strand line discloses. But this strand line is tilted, and in other places it is more than 360 feet above the present level of the lake. There are numerous raised beaches, and stress was put on the freshness of many of the strand lines, and the modern character of such fossils as occur. Further investigation into the topography of the Andes and the fauna of Lake Titicaca, together with a chemical analysis of this lake and others on the same plateau, established that the plateau was at one time at sea level, or 12,500 feet lower than it is today. Titicaca and Pupo Lake and salt bed of Coipaga, the salt beds of Uyeni, several of these lakes and salt beds have chemical compositions similar to those of the ocean. As long ago as 1875, Alexander Agassiz demonstrated the existence of a marine crustaceous fauna in Lake Titicaca. At a higher elevation, the sediment of an enormous dried-up lake, whose waters were almost potable, is full of characteristic mollusks such as Paludestrina and Ancyllis, which shows that it is, geologically speaking, of relatively modern origin. Sometime in the remote past, the entire Altiplano with its lakes rose from the bottom of the ocean. At some other time point a city was built there, and terraces were laid out on the elevation around it. Then, in another disturbance, the mountains were thrust up, and the area became uninhabitable. The barrier of the Cordilleras that separates the Altiplano from the valley to the east was torn apart, and gigantic blocks were thrown into the chasm. Lyell, combating the idea of a universal flood, offered the theory that the bursting of the Sierra barrier opened the way for a large lake on the Altiplano, which cascaded down into the valley and caused the Aborigines to create the myth of a universal flood. Not so long ago, an explanation of the mystery of Lake Titicaca and of the fortress Tiwanaku on its shore was put forward in light of Horbiger's theory. A moon circled very close to the Earth, pulling the waters of the oceans toward the equator. By its gravitational pull, the moon held day and night water of the ocean at the altitude of Tiwanaku. The level of the ocean must have been at least 13,000 feet higher. Then the moon crashed into the Earth, and the oceans receded to the poles, leaving the island with its megalithic city and its mountain above the sea bottom. Now the continent of the tropical and subtropical Americas. All this happened millions of years before our moon was caught by the Earth, and thus the ruins of the megalithic city Tiwanaku are millions of years old. That is, the city must have been built long before the flood. I never heard that theory, have you? That's pretty wild. This theory is bizarre. The geological record indicates a late elevation of the Andes, and the time of its origin is brought even closer to our time. Archaeological and radiocarbon analysis indicate that the age of the Andean culture and of the city is not much older than 4,000 years. Not only the built before the flood theory collapses, so does the belief that the last elevation of the Andes was in the Territory or more than 1,000,000 years ago. Sometime in the remote past, the Altiplano was at or below sea level, so that originally its lakes were part of a sea gulf. The last upheaval, however, took place in an early historical period after the city of Tiwanaku had been built. The lakes were dragged up, and the Altiplano and the entire chain of the Andes rose to their present height. The ancient stronghold of Ollantaytambo in Peru is built on top of an elevation. It is constructed of blocks of stone 12 to 18 feet high. These Cyclopean stones were hewn from the quarry 7 miles away. How the stones were carried down the river in the valley, shipped on rafts, and carried up to the site of the fortress remains a mystery archaeologists cannot solve. Another fortress or monastery, Ollantayperudo, in the Urubamba Valley in Peru, northeast of Lake Titicaca, perches upon a tiny plateau some 13,000 feet above sea level, in an uninhabitable region of precipices and chasms and gorges. It is built of red porphyry blocks. The blocks must have been brought from a considerable distance, down steep slopes, across swift and turbulent rivers, up on precipitous rock faces, which hardly allow a foothold. It has been suggested that the transportation of the building blocks was feasible only if the topography of these localities was different at the time of construction. However, definite proof in this connection is lacking, and changes in topography must be deduced from abandoned terraces, from mollusks of the dried-up lakes, from tilted shorelines, and from other similar indications. Charles Darwin, on his travels in South America in 1834-35, was impressed by the raised beaches at Valparaiso, Chile, and the foot of the Andes. He found that the former surf line was at an altitude of 1,300 feet. He was impressed even more by the fact that the seashells found at this altitude were still undecayed. To him, a clear indication that the land had risen 1,300 feet from the Pacific Ocean in a very recent period, within the period during which upraised shells remained undecayed on the surface. And since only a few intermediary surf lines can be detected, the elevation could not have proceeded little by little. Darwin also observed that the exclusively disturbed condition of the strata in the Cordillera, so far from indicating single periods of extreme violence, presents insuperable difficulties, except on the admission that the masses of once liquefied rocks of the axes were repeatedly injected with intervals sufficiently long for their successive cooling and consolidation. At present, it is common view that the Andes were created not so much by compression of the strata as by magma or molten rock invading the strata and lifting them. The Andes also abound in volcanoes and exceedingly high and enormously large. The foothills of the Andes hide numerous deserted towns and abandoned terraces, monuments to a vanished civilization. The terraces that go up the slopes of the Andes and reach the eternal snow line and continue under the snow to some unidentified altitude prove that it was not a conqueror nor a plague that put the seal of death on gardens and towns in Peru. Aerial surveys in the dry belt west of the Andes have shown an unexpected number of old ruins and an almost incredible number of terraces for cultivation. One such mass attained the thickness of 1,000 feet. At these deluges of molten stone and aqueous deposits 5 times alternatively had been spread out. The ocean, which receives such thick masses, must have been profoundly deep, but again the subterranean forces exerted themselves, and now I beheld the bed of that ocean forming a chain of mountains more than 7,000 feet in height, vast and scarcely comprehensible, such as such changes must ever appear, yet they have all occurred within a period recent when compared with the history of the Cordillera, and the Cordillera itself is absolutely modern as compared with the many of the fossiliferous strata of Europe and America. But how extremely young the Cordillera of the Andes is, only the research of recent years has brought out. End of chapter. That was not a reader-friendly chapter. I was winging it on quite a few of them. I hope I got them right. Seems to me the earth was being twisted like a rubber ball, or it was in a dog's mouth or something. Just went through hell. Lucky it's still here. No wonder half of it died. The Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert, which stretches from the Nile to the Atlantic across the continent of Africa and covers 3,500,000 square miles, about the area of all of Europe, is the greatest desert on Earth. What is now the Desert of Sahara was an open grassland or steppe in earlier days. Drawings on rocks of herds of cattle, made by early dwellers in this region, were discovered by Barth in 1850. Since then, many more drawings have been found. The animals depicted no longer inhabit these regions, and many are generally extinct. It is asserted that the Sahara once had a large human population that lived in vast green forests and on fat pasture lands. Neolithic implements, vessels, and weapons made of polished stone were found close to the drawings. Drawings and implements were discovered in the eastern as well as the western Sahara. Men lived in these densely populated flint regions, and cattle pastured where today enormous expanses of sand stretch for thousands of miles. Several theories have been offered to explain the prodigious quantity of sand in the Sahara. The theory of marine origin is no longer tenable. The sand, it was found, is of recent origin. It is assumed that when a large part of Europe was under ice, the Sahara was in a warm, moist, temperate zone. Later, the soil lost its moisture, and the rock crumbled to sand when left to the mercy of the sand and the wind. How long ago was it that conditions in the Sahara were suitable for human occupation? Movers, the noted Orientalist of the last century, author of a large work on the Phoenicians, decided that the drawings in the Sahara were the work of the Phoenicians. It was likewise observed that the drawings discovered by Barth, the cattle wore discs between their horns, just as in Egyptian drawings. Also, the Egyptian god Set was found pictured on the rocks. And there are rock paintings of war chariots drawn by horses, in an area where these animals could not survive 2 days without extraordinary precautions. The extinct animals in the drawings suggest that these pictures were made sometime during the Ice Age. But the Egyptian motifs in the very same drawings suggest that they were made in historical times. The conflict between the historical and the paleontological evidence, and of both of them with the geological evidence, is resolved if one or more catastrophes intervened. It appears that a large part of the region was occupied by an inland lake or a vast marsh known to the ancients as Lake Triton. In a stupendous catastrophe, the lake emptied itself into the Atlantic, and the sand on its bottom and shores was left behind, forming a desert when tectonic movements sealed off the springs that fed the lake. The land of pastures and forests became a desert of sand. Hippopotami that lived in water and elephants disappeared, and with them also the hunter and the farmer. A French savant, A. Berthelot, says, "It is possible that Stone Age man witnessed in Africa 3 notable events: the sinking of the Spanish Atlas chain that opened the Strait of Gibraltar and created a junction between the Mediterranean Sea and the ocean; the collapse that cut off the Canary Islands from the African continent; the opening of the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, separating Arabia from Ethiopia." Berthelot, however, ascribed these great tectonic changes to the time of prehistoric man, and Abbe Bruel actually showed that prehistoric man already occupied these regions, as the Eolithic or very crudely chipped stone artifacts indicate. But at a later date, people of advanced culture, contemporary with Pharaonic Egypt, lived in communities, pastured their cattle, and left their tools and drawings there. Then, in an upheaval, of which many traditions persist in classical literature, the Atlas Mountains were torn apart. The Great Lake was emptied, and the watery region became the great and awesome desert, the Sahara. Arabia. There is a certainty beyond challenge that when the ice cap of the last glacial period covered a large part of the northern hemisphere, at least 3 great rivers flowed from west to east across the whole width of the Arabian Peninsula. So wrote Philby in his book Arabia. There was also a large lake in Arabia that disappeared in some geological or climatal change. At present, from Palmyra to Mecca and beyond, the Arabian Peninsula is a waterless desert, interspersed with volcanoes, active not so long ago, but now extinct, the last eruption having taken place in 1253. There were also, sometime in the past, numerous geysers, all likewise extinct now. 28 fields of burned and broken stones, called haras, are found in Arabia, mostly in the western half of the Great Desert. Some single fields are 100 miles in diameter and occupy an area of 6,000 or 7,000 square miles. Stone lying close to stone, so densely packed that passage through the field is almost impossible. The stones are sharp-edged and scorched, black. No volcanic eruption could have cast scorched stones over fields as large as the Sahara's. Neither would the stones from volcanoes have been so evenly spread. The absence, in most cases, of lava, the stones lie free, also speaks against a volcanic origin of the stones. It appears that the blackened and broken stones of the Sahara's are trains of meteorites, scorched in their passage through the atmosphere, that broke during their fall, as bolides do. Or, on reaching the ground, billions of stones in a single Sahara indicate that the trains of meteorites were very large and can be classed as comets. Despite alternate exposure to the thermal action of the hot desert sun and the cool desert night, the sharp edges of stones have been preserved, which shows that they fell in a not-too-distant period of time. Following the procedure adopted in this book, literary references to the Saharas of Arabia in ancient Hebrew and Arabic literatures will not be dealt with here. Meteorites that fall on the earth are of two kinds. One consists of iron and an admixture of nickel. By means of this admixture and the characteristic patterns seen in the cut surface of such stones, their meteoric origin can be easily established. The other group, probably larger than the first, does not differ in its composition from the rocks of the earth and cannot be distinguished unless the fall has been observed, or has, in the case of the stones of the Saharas, their scorched and broken condition, together with their occurrence in large fields, speak for their extraterrestrial origin. Larger bodies than the stones of the Saharas fell on Arabia too. In Wobar in the desert, there is a meteoric crater, with meteoric iron and silica glass spread around it. Large rivers that dispersed numerous volcanoes that burned and were extinguished, blackened stones that fell, in areas, each of them 100 times larger than any volcanic eruption could have covered, and meteoric iron spread around a large crater. All of these bespeak great upheavals in nature in recent as well as earlier ages, to which the vast peninsula of Arabia was more than once subjected. In the southern part of the great Arabian desert, ancient ruins almost entirely obliterated by time and the elements and vestiges of cultivation are silent witnesses of the time when the land there was hospitable and fruitful. It was as copiously watered and luxuriously forested as India on the same latitude. Orchards covered Hadramount and Aden. It was a land of plenty, paradise on the earth, but following a sudden catastrophe, Arabia Felix turned to a barren land. Arabia Petrea, the western part of the desert, is a dusty rock of lava that is broken by the Great Rift with the Dead Sea, an inner lake on its bottom. Sulphurous springs flow into it, and ashfall rises from its floor and floats on it. Yeah, that whole part of the earth just seems to be dead. Like the Sahara and Arabian deserts, other great deserts of the world disclose the fact that they were inhabited and cultivated sometime in the past. On the Tibetan Plateau and in the Gobi Desert, remains of early, prosperous civilizations were found, with occasional ruins surviving from those times when the great barren tracts were cultivated. In the Gobi Desert, as in the Arabian and Sahara deserts, the impression is gained that in a tectonic disturbance, the subterranean water dropped to a great depth. The sources became sealed, and the rivers dried up completely. Some changes in ground structure or in ground currents also affect the clouds, which pass over such lands without unburdening themselves. The Carolina Bays. Peculiar elliptical depressions, or oval craters, locally called bays, are thickly scattered over the Carolina coast of the United States, and more sparsely over the entire Atlantic coastal plain, from southern New Jersey to northeastern Florida. These marshy depressions are numbered in the tens of thousands, and according to the latest estimate, their number may reach 500,000. Measurements made on more prominent ones, seaward from Darlington, show that the larger bays average 2,200 feet in length, and in single cases exceeded 8,000 feet. A remarkable feature of these depressions is their parallelism. The long axis of each of them extends from northwest to southeast, and the precision of the parallelism is striking. Around the bays are the rims of Earth, invariably elevated at the southeastern end. These aural depressions may be seen especially well in aerial photographs. Any theory as to their origin must explain their form, the ellipticity of which increases with the size of the bays, their parallel alignment, and the elevated rims at their southeastern ends. In 1933, a theory was presented by Melton and Shriver of the University of Oklahoma, according to which the bays are scars left by a meteoric shower or colliding comet. Since then, the majority of the authors who have dealt with the problem have accepted this view, and it has found its way into textbooks as the usual interpretation. The authors of the theory stress the fact that since the origin of the bays apparently cannot be explained by the well-known types of geological activity, an extraordinary process must be found. Such a process is suggested by the elliptical shape, the parallel alignment, and the systematic arrangement of the elevated rims. The comet must have struck from the northwest. If the cosmic masses approached this region from the northwest, the major axes would have the desired alignment. The time when the catastrophe took place was estimated as sometime during the Ice Age. The bays are filled to a considerable extent by the deposition of sand and silt, a process which doubtless occurred while the region was covered by the sea during the terrace-forming marine invasion of the Pleistocene glacial period. But the possibility was also envisaged that the collision took place through the shallow ocean water during the marine invasion. The swarm of meteorites must have been large enough to hit an area from Florida to New Jersey. Some critics disagree with the idea that the bays originated in the Ice Age or are relatively ancient and place their origin in a more recent time. Some critics disagree with the idea that the bays originated in the Ice Age or are relatively ancient and place their origin in a more recent time. The craters were produced by meteoric impact, either by direct hits or by explosion in the air close to the ground, thus causing the formation of vast numbers of depressions. Some of the bays, it is assumed, are on the bottom of the ocean. It was also stressed that a very large number of meteorites have been discovered in the southern Appalachian region, in Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Kentucky, and Tennessee. End of subchapter. The bottom of the Atlantic. In the fall of 1949, Professor M. Ewing of Columbia University published a report on an expedition to the Atlantic Ocean. Explorations were carried on especially in the region about the mid-Atlantic ridge, the mountainous chain that runs from north to south, following the general outlines of the ocean. The ridge, as well as the ocean bottom to the west and to the east, disclosed to the expedition a series of facts that amounts to new scientific puzzles. One was the discovery of prehistoric beach sand, brought up in one case from a depth of 2 and the other nearly 3½ miles, far from any place where beaches exist today. I wonder how they knew it was beach sand. One of these sand deposits was found 1,200 miles from land. Sand is produced from rocks by the eroding action of sea waves pounding the coast, and by the action of rain and wind and the alteration of heat and cold. On the bottom of the ocean, the temperature is constant. There are no currents. It is a region of motionless stillness. Mid-ocean bottoms are covered with ooze made up of silt so fine that its particles can be carried, suspended in ocean water for a long time before they sink to the bottom, there to build sediment. The ooze contains skeletons of the minute animals, foraminifera, that live in the upper waters of the ocean in vast numbers. Oh, I see. There should be no coarse sand on the mid-ocean floor, because sand is native to the land areas and to the continental shelf, the coastal rim of the ocean and its seas. These considerations presented Professor Ewing with a dilemma. Either the land must have sunk 2 to 3 miles, or the sea once must have been 2 to 3 miles lower than now. Either conclusion is startling. If the sea was once 2 miles lower, where could all the extra water have gone? It is regarded as an accepted truth in geology that the seas have not changed their beds, with the exception of encroachment by shallow water on depressed continental areas. Thus, it was difficult to accept the startling conclusion that the bottom of the ocean was at one time in the past dry land. But there was another surprise in store for the expedition. The thickness of the sediment on the ocean bottom was measured by the well-developed method of sound echoes. An explosion is set off, and the time it takes for the echo to return from the sediment on the floor of the ocean is compared with the time required for a second echo to return from the bottom of the sediment, or from the bedrock, basalt, or granite. These measurements clearly indicate thousands of feet of sediments on the foothills of the ridge. Surprisingly, however, we have found that in the great flat basins on either side of the ridge, this sediment appears to be less than 100 feet thick, a fact so startling. Actually, the echoes arrived almost simultaneously, and the most that could be attributed in such circumstances to the sediment was less than 100 feet of thickness, or the margin of error. Always it had been thought the sediment must be extremely thick, since it had been accumulating for countless ages. But on the level basins that flank the mid-Atlantic ridge, our signals reflected from the bottom mud and from bedrock came back too close together to measure the time between them. They show the sediment in the basins is less than 100 feet thick. The absence of thick sediment on the level floor presents another of many scientific riddles our expedition propounded. It indicates that the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean on both sides of the ridge was only very recently formed. At the same time, on the flanks of the ridge, the layers of sediment in some places are thousands of feet thick, as was expected. These ocean bottom sediments we measured are formed from the shells and skeletons of countless small sea creatures. You thinking what I'm thinking? And from volcanic dust on the wind-blown soil drifting out over the sea. And from the ashes of burned-out meteorites and cosmic dust from outer space, sifting constantly down upon the earth. Burned-out meteorites and cosmic dust elicited the question, if the meteoric dust in our age is so sparse that it is hardly detectable on the snow of high mountains, how could ashes of burned-out meteorites and cosmic dust make up a substantial part of the oceanic sediment? And how could it be that all other sources, including detritus carried by rivers, have created in all ages since the beginning a sediment of only very moderate thickness? We dredged up rocks of igneous or fire-made type from the sides and tops of peaks on the mid-Atlantic ridge, which indicated that submarine volcanoes and lava flows have been active there. Probably the whole ridge is highly volcanic, with perhaps thousands of lava outpourings and active and extinct cones scattered along its entire length. And not only the submarine ridge is volcanic. There are many peaks of volcanic origin scattered over the Atlantic basin. In the direction of the Azores, the expedition found an uncharted submarine mountain, 8,000 feet high, with many layers of volcanic ash, and farther on a great hole dropping down 1,809 fathoms, 10,854 feet, as if a volcano had carved in there at some time in the past. Lava flowed under the water of the ocean, and the water must have boiled. Meteorites, ashes, and cosmic dust fell from the sky. Land was submerged thousands of fathoms deep, and beaches sank over 3 miles into the depths. Holy smokes. From the abyss of the ocean, rocks marked with deep scratches were raised by the expedition. In a depth of 3,600 feet, 600 fathoms, we found rocks that tell an interesting story about the past history of the Atlantic Ocean. Granite and sedimentary rocks of types which originally must have been part of a continent. Most of the rocks that we dredged here were rounded and marked with deep scratches or striations. Such marks on rocks are regularly ascribed to the action of glaciers that held rocks in a firm grip and moved them over the surface of other rocks. But we also found some loosely consolidated mudstones, so soft and weak they would not have held together in the iron grasp of the glacier. How they got out here is another riddle to be solved by further research. Finally, the very entrance to New York Harbor, the Hudson River, was found to have a canyon running into the ocean, not only for the width of the continental shelf 120 miles offshore, as has been known for some time, but also for another 100 miles in deep water. If all this valley was originally carved out by the river on dry land, as seems probable, it means either that the ocean floor of the eastern seaboard of North America once must have stood about 2 miles above its present level, and has since subsided, or else that the level of the sea was once about 2 miles lower than now. Each one of these possibilities indicates an upheaval. All in all, the results of the expedition of the summer of 1949 strongly indicate that at some time, not so long ago, in numerous places where the Atlantic Ocean is today, there were land and beaches, and that in revolutions on a great scale, land became sea, thousands of fathoms deep. The leader of the Atlantis expedition, whom we have, how convenient, the Atlantis expedition, whom we have quoted here, did not use the term revolution, but it is unavoidable in the face of the expedition's finds, in order not to be regarded as the proponent of a hearsay. Ewing only made a negative statement. There is no reason to believe that this mighty underwater mass of mountains is connected in any way with the legendary lost Atlantis, which Plato described as having sunk beneath the waves. The floor of the seas. In July 1947, a Swedish deep-sea expedition left Gothenburg, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, on the Albatross for a 15-month journey around the world to investigate the bottom of the seas on the 17,000 miles of the ship's course with the help of a newly constructed vacuum core sampler. In the sediment that covers the rocky bottom of the oceans, the expedition found, in the words of its leader, H. Peterson, director of the Oceanographic Institute at Gothenburg, evidence of great catastrophes that have altered the face of the earth. Climactic catastrophes, which piled thousands of feet of ice on the higher latitudes of the continents, also covered the oceans with icebergs and ice fields at lower latitudes, and chilled the surface waters even down to the equator. Volcanic catastrophes cast rains of ash over the sea. This ash is preserved in the sedimentary bottom of the oceans. Tectonic catastrophes raised or lowered the ocean bottom hundreds, even thousands of feet, spreading huge tidal waves which destroyed plant and animal life on the coastal plains. At many places, such as the coast of Sweden, the bottom of the sea proved to consist of a lava bed of geologically recent origin, covered only by a thin veneer of sediment. The sediments of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, which often bore particles of volcanic material, also testified to the importance of volcanism in submarine geology. Some of our cores from the Mediterranean were marked with a coarse-grained layers consisting largely of volcanic ash that had settled on the bottom after great volcanic explosions. These layers are an unrivaled record of the irregular volcanic activity of the past. The oceanic floor all around the globe bears witness that the oceans of the earth were the scenes of repeated violent catastrophes when flows of lava and volcanic ash covered the precipitously rising or falling bedrock and tidal waves raced against the continents. The bottom of the seas and the oceans also contains evidence that the earth was showered with meteorites on a very large scale. In many cases, the bottom consists of red clay. Samples of red clay from the Central Pacific showed a surprisingly high content of nickel, and also a high content of radium. Though the water of the ocean is almost completely free of these elements, the red clay is red because it contains ferruginous iron compounds. Meteoric iron differs from iron of terrestrial origin in its admixture of nickel, and it is this characteristic that makes it possible to differentiate iron tools of early ages, for instance, of the Pyramid Age in Egypt, and to decide whether iron pieces were smelted from ore or were worked meteorites. Nickel is a very rare element in most terrestrial rocks and continental sediment, and it is almost absent from ocean waters. On the other hand, it is one of the main components of meteorites. Thus, it is assumed that the origin of the abysmal nickel was in meteoric dust, or the very heavy showers of meteors in the remote past. The principal difficulty of this explanation is that it requires a rate of accretion of meteoric dust several hundred times greater than that which astronomers, who base their estimates on visual and telescopic counts of meteors, are presently prepared to admit. In a later publication, a popularized account of the Albatross expedition, Peterson writes, assuming the average nickel content of meteoric dust to be 2%, an approximate value for the rate of accretion of cosmic dust to the whole Earth can be worked out from these data. The result is very high, about 10,000 tons per day, or over 1,000 times higher than the value computed from counting shooting stars and estimating their mass. In other words, at some time, or times, there was such a fall of meteoric dust that, apportioned throughout the entire age of the ocean, it would increase 1,000-fold the daily accumulation of meteoric dust since the birth of the ocean. The ash and lava on the bottom of the oceans indicate catastrophic occurrences in the past. Iron and nickel point to celestial showers of meteorites, and thus possibly also to the cause of tectonic ruptures, of the collapse of the ocean floor, and of the outburst of lava under the surface of great oceanic spaces. Evidence of great upheavals has been brought forth from the islands of the Arctic Ocean and the tundras of Siberia, from the soil of Alaska, from Spitsbergen, and from Greenland, from the caves of England, the forest bed of Norfolk, and the rock fissures of Wales and Cornwall, from the rocks of France, the Alps and Juras, and from Gibraltar and Sicily, from the Sahara and the rift of Africa, from Arabia and its Harras, the Kashmir slopes of the Himalayas, and the Siwalik hills, from the Irrawaddy in Burma, and from the Tintsan and Chocked deposits in China, from the Andes and the Altiplano from the asphalt pits of California, from the Rocky Mountains and the Columbia Plateau, from the Cumberland Cave in Maryland and Agate Spring Quarry in Nebraska, from the hills of Michigan and Vermont with skeletons of whales on them, from the Carolina coast, from the submerged coast and the bottom of the Atlantic with its ridge and the lava bottom of the Pacific, of the many other places in various parts of the world. We shall deal in some detail in the pages that follow, but we shall not exhaust the list, for there is not a meridian of longitude or a degree of latitude that does not show scars of repeated upheavals. End of chapter. Chapter 8. Poles displaced, the cause of the ice ages. One after the other, scenes of upheaval and devastation have presented themselves to explorers, and almost every new cave opened, mountain thrust explored, undersea canyon investigated, has consistently disclosed the same picture of violence and desolation. Under the weight of this evidence, two great theories of the 19th century have become more and more strained, the theory of uniformity and the theory of evolution built upon it. The other fundamental teaching originated in the 19th century, the theory of ice ages, has been loaded more and more heavily with the responsibility for the geological facts revealed. However, the cause of the ice ages remained a much discussed and never agreed upon subject. The origin of the glacial periods was sought on the earth below and in the heaven above. The theories that endeavored to explain what caused them fall under the following headings: astronomical, geological, and atmospherical. In the first group, some theories seek the cause of the ice ages in space, some in the sun, some in the relative positions of the sun and the earth. One idea was that the space through which the solar system traveled was not always of equally low temperature, the variations being due to gases or dust present in some areas. This idea has been abandoned. Another theory was that the sun is a variable star emitting more heat at some periods and less at others. This theory also failed to be substantiated and was generally rejected. Yet sporadically it finds new proponents. Still another theory would have the ice ages arrive when a hemisphere, the northern or the southern, happens to have its winter while the globe is at the furthest end of its ellipse, as the southern hemisphere is at present. The winter would be a little longer and colder. However, the summer, though a bit shorter, would be hotter, and if the Earth always traveled on its present orbit, the described variations would not bring about an ice age. It was also claimed that the terrestrial orbit becomes alternately more and less stretched. Of the geological group of theories, one supposed a change in the activity of warm springs, another a change in the direction of the Gulf Stream, which carries water warmed in the Caribbean to the northern Atlantic. If there were no Isthmus of Panama and North and South America were separated, the part of the stream from the Caribbean would flow into the Pacific. Both of these theories were shown to be inadequate. The paleontological survey of sea fauna on both sides of the isthmus suggests that the dividing strip of land existed long before the advent of the Ice Age. Another geological theory, which still has some adherents, sees the origin of the glacial periods in the changing altitude of the continents, which would also influence the direction of the winds and precipitation. But it is definitely opposed by such an authority on glacial geology as A.P. Coleman, Professor Emeritus of Geology at Toronto University. When one considers the distribution of ice sheets in the Pleistocene, covering 4 million square miles of North America and half as much of Europe, and the ice in Greenland, Iceland, Spitsbergen, the southern island of New Zealand, and Patagonia in South America, it becomes evident that all parts of the world could not have been elevated at once. The theory breaks down of its own weight. Therefore, elevation above snowline would cause local glaciation. But there is no evidence that large-scale ice sheets can be formed in this way, and that a universal refrigeration like that of the Pleistocene could be produced thus is manifestly impossible. Of the atmospheric conditions that could effect a rise or drop in temperature, the varying quantity of carbon dioxide in the air and also of dust particles was called on to explain the changes in temperature in the past. With the diminution of the carbon dioxide content in the air, there would be a fall in the temperature, but it was demonstrated by calculation that this could not have been sufficient to cause the Ice Age. If the Earth were enveloped in clouds of dust that kept the rays of the sun from penetrating to the ground, there would be a fall in temperature. However, one would have to explain where such extensive and thick clouds of dust in the atmosphere could come from. Scores of methods of accounting for ice ages have been proposed, and probably no other geological problem has been so earnestly discussed, not only by geologists but by meteorologists and biologists, and yet no theory is generally accepted. A true theory of origin of ice ages, whether resorting to astronomical, geological, or atmospheric causes, must also explain why ice ages did not occur in northeastern Siberia, the coldest place on Earth. I mean, they all agree that there must have been an ice age, but none of them agree on how that came about. That's pretty good. But it did occur in temperate latitudes and in a much more remote past in India, Madagascar, and equatorial Brazil. None of the theories mentioned explains these strange facts. Very strange indeed. Hypotheses concerning warmer and colder areas in space, or the variability of the sun as a source of energy, are especially inadequate to account for the geographical distribution of the ice cover. Thus, the concept of ice ages, which is established in science as one of its most definite facts, serving also as a foundation for the theory of evolution, has no explanation itself. Shifting poles. All other theories of the origin of the Ice Age have failed. There remain an avenue of approach, which already early in the discussion was chosen by several geologists, a shift of the terrestrial poles. If for some reason the poles had moved from their original positions, old polar ice would have moved out of the Arctic and Antarctic circles and into new regions. The glacial cover of the Ice Age could have been the polar ice cap of an earlier epoch. Thus would be explained not only the origin of the ice cover, but also the fact that its geographical position did not coincide with the present polar circles. The simplest and most obvious explanation of great secular changes in climate and of former prevalence of higher temperatures in northern circumpolar regions would be found in the assumption that the Earth's axis of rotation was not always the same position, but that it may have changed its position as a result of geological processes, such as extended rearrangement of land and water. For decades, in the second half of the 19th century, many scientists participated in the debate centering around this theme. Astronomers and mathematicians asked the geologists what, in their opinion, could have caused such a shifting of the terrestrial poles. The best the geologists could offer was the redisposition of the weight on the surface of the Earth. Sir George B. Airy, Astronomer Royal, analyzed the question by assuming that the Earth, a perfectly rigid spheroid, a flattened globe, was disturbed in its rotation by a sudden elevation of mountainous mass in latitudes most favorable for production of a large effect. The axis of rotation would no longer coincide with the axis of figure. There would be wobbling. Under these circumstances, the axis of rotation would wander in the solid Earth, but it would not wander indefinitely. However, the smallest of the effect would be disappointing if a mountain mass should be produced equal to 1/1000th part of the mass of the equatorial bulge, which I apprehend is very far above the fact. The shift of the Earth's pole would be only 2 or 3 miles. This, though it would greatly surprise astronomers, would produce no such changes of climate as those it is desired to explain. Sir George Darwin, mathematician and cosmologist, the renowned son of an illustrious father, made more thorough calculations on this point. If an ocean bed 15,000 feet deep rose to become a continent the size of Africa, 1,100 feet above sea level, and on the other side of the globe an equal area became depressed, the effect would be a shift of the poles by about 2 degrees. However, where the Earth plastic, the poles would wander to a greater extent. Oh, were the Earth made of plastic? I assume he means that. However, were the Earth plastic, the poles would wander to a greater extent. James Croll, the Scottish climatologist, wrote, "There probably never was an upheaval of such magnitude in the history of our Earth. And to produce a deflection of 3 degrees 17, a deflection that would hardly sensibly affect climate, no less than 1/10 of the entire surface of the Earth, would require to be elevated to the height of 10,000 feet. A continent 10 times the size of Europe, elevated 2 miles, would do little more than bring London to the latitude of Edinburgh, or Edinburgh to the latitude of London. He must be a sanguine geologist. Indeed, who can expect to account for the glaciation of this country, or for the former absence of ice around the poles by this means? We know perfectly well that since the glacial epoch there have been no changes in the physical geography of the Earth sufficient to deflect the pole half a dozen miles, far less half a dozen degrees. J. Evans, a geologist, suggested that the astronomers reconsider their conclusion on the supposition that the Earth is a shell filled with molten matter. He envisaged the possibility that under a change of load in the crust would be forced to alter its position in relation to the axis by as much as 20 degrees. Sir William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, the physicist, took up the issue and reported that the Earth cannot, as many geologists suppose, be a liquid mass enclosed in only a thin shell of solidified matter at the surface and for many miles below the surface. The rigidity of the Earth is certainly very much less than that of iron, and therefore at great depths the rigidity must be enormously greater than at the surface. Whatever be its age, we may be quite sure the Earth is solid in its interior, and we must utterly reject any geographical hypothesis which assumes the solid Earth to be a shell of 30 or 100 or 500 or 1,000 kilometers thickness, resting on an interior of liquid mass. Lord Kelvin showed that if the Earth were a liquid mass covered with a solid crust, the solid crust would yield so freely to the deforming influence of sun and moon that it would simply carry the waters of the oceans up and down with it, and there would be no sensible tidal rise or fall of water relatively to it. The state of the case is shortly this: the hypothesis of a perfectly rigid crust containing liquid violates physics by assuming preternaturally rigid matter and violates dynamical astronomy. Lord Kelvin admitted, however, that a larger shifting of the poles would be possible if the Earth had a solid nucleus in the interior separated by a liquid layer from the outer crust. This he regarded as improbable, and directed his argument against an Earth with a molten interior.
George Darwin reported the views of Lord Kelvin, presenting figures to show that the Earth could not have a fluid nucleus. Its rigidity must be at least as great as that of steel. Thus, the efforts of the geologists to explain the origin of the ice cover by the shifting of poles foundered on the calculations of the mathematicians. Oh, they're in on that too. A mathematician made the point clear.
Mathematicians may seem to geologists almost churlish in their unwillingness to admit a change in the Earth's axis. Geologists scarcely know how much is involved in what they ask. They do not seem to realize the vastness of the Earth's size, or the enormous quantity of her motion. When a mass of matter is in rotation about an axis, it cannot be made to rotate about a new one, except by external force. Internal changes cannot alter the axis. Only the distribution of matter in motion about it, outside of it, is what he means. If the mass began to revolve about a new axis, every particle would begin to move in a different direction. What is to cause this? Where is the force that could deflect every portion of it, and every particle of the Earth into a new direction of motion? Searching for causes in the Earth itself, the geologists offered a theory concerning changes on the surface of the globe, which, as the astronomers calculated, could have displaced the poles, but only to an extent entirely inadequate to account for the ice cover and the ice age. The explanation that appeared best to the geologists was rejected by the physicists and astronomers, who, for their part, could not propose any other satisfactory solution. Further developments showed that tides in the terrestrial crust, under the influence of moon and sun, unknown to Lord Kelvin, do exist, though they are minute. This seems that the Earth is not perfectly rigid. It is also found that the Earth makes a real wobbling motion. S.C. Chandler, an American astronomer, 1846 to 1913, explained the wobbling of the Earth as an indication of its being removed from a balanced position. Simon Newcomb, foremost American mathematical astronomer, in his paper on the periodic variation of latitude, wrote, Chandler's remarkable discovery that the apparent variation in terrestrial latitudes may be accounted for by supposing a revolution of the axis of rotation of the Earth around that of figure is in such disaccord with the received theory of the Earth's rotation that, at first, I was disposed to doubt its possibility. However, on reconsideration, he found a theoretical justification. Theory then shows that the axis of rotation will revolve around that of figure in a period of 306 days and in a direction from west toward east. G.V. Schiaparelli, the Italian astronomer, in his research de la rotation de la Terre sous influence des actions géologiques, 1889, pointed out that in case of displacement, the pole of inertia, or of figure, and the new pole of rotation would describe circles around each other, and the Earth would be in a state of strain. The Earth is at present in this condition, and as a result, the pole of rotation describes a small circle in 304 days, known as the Eulerian circle. This phenomenon of wobbling points to a displacement of the terrestrial poles sometime in the past. The question centers then on the forces that could have caused such a shift. Schiaparelli wrote, "The performance of the geographical poles in the very same regions of the Earth cannot be considered as incontestably established by astronomical or mechanical arguments. Such permanence may be a fact today, but it remains a matter still to be proven for the preceding ages of the history of the globe. He thought that a series of geological changes could, by their cumulative effect, step by step, destroy the equilibrium of the Earth, on condition that the Earth is not an absolutely rigid body. The possibility of great shifting of the pole is an important element in the discussion of prehistoric climates, and the distribution, geographic or chronologic, of ancient organisms. If this possibility is admitted, it will open new horizons for the study of great mechanical revolutions that the crust of the Earth underwent in the past. We cannot imagine, for instance, that the terrestrial equator could take the place of a meridian without great horizontal tension. In some regions, that would open great rifts, and in other regions, horizontal compressions would have taken place, such as are imagined today in order to explain the folding of the strata and formation of the mountains. The resistance of the spheroid, or the terrestrial globe, flattened at the poles to a change in position must, in Schiaparelli's opinion, show itself also in the leveling of great areas and the extension of shallow seas, like that of the Baltic and the North Seas. He finished by saying, "Our problem, so important from the astronomical and mathematical standpoint, touches the foundations of geology and paleontology. Its solution is tied to the most grandiose events in the history of the Earth." Thus, finally, an eminent astronomer, after a thorough examination of the problem, went over to the side of the geologist. However, he reasoned in a circle, the geological changes would cause the terrestrial poles to move from their places, and the motion of the poles from their places would cause geological and climatal changes. A gradual and slow displacement of the poles, or a tilting of the axis, would explain the geographical position of the ice in the past, but it would not account for other phenomena observed, such as the extent of the glacial cover and the suddenness with which it enveloped the Earth. Agassiz realized this, and in support of the idea that the ice ages came suddenly, he quoted Cuvier. Cuvier died before the Ice Age theory was promulgated, but he understood that the climate must have altered suddenly in order to encase the large quadrupeds of Siberia in ice as soon as they were killed, and to preserve their bodies from decay since then. Therefore, wrote Cuvier in prophetic anticipation of the debate that has been renewed for over 100 years, down to our times, all hypotheses of a gradual cooling of the Earth or a slow variation of the inclination or position of the terrestrial axis are inadequate. The sliding continents. The geological changes in the distribution of land and water being inadequate to explain the shifting of the poles, the problem is thrown back once more onto the domain of astronomy. But before we ask what forces in the solar system could have displaced the terrestrial axis, we shall discuss a theory that has for over 3 decades occupied the minds of geologists, climatologists, and evolutionists. The theory of the shifting continents. Instead of the poles shifting according to Wagner's theory, the continents drift and pass one after the other through the southern and northern polar regions. In August 1950, the British Association for the Advancement of Science devoted the sessions of its annual convention to debate on the question, is the theory of the continental drift slide right or wrong? There were many defenders of the theory, and as many opponents. The theory was then put to a vote. The result was an even division between yea and nay. The chairman was entitled to cast the deciding vote, but abstained. Only through the fortuitous circumstance that the presiding officer was a conscientious or undecided person, was the sanctification of continental drift averted. The theory of drifting continents, debated since the 1920s, has its starting point in the similarity of the shapes of the coastlines of Brazil and Africa. This similarity, or better complementation, plus some early faunal and floral affinities suggested to Professor Alfred Wegener in Styria that in an early geographical age these two continents, South America and Africa, were one landmass. But since animal and vegetable affinities could also be found in other parts of the world, Wegener conjectured that all continents and islands were once a single landmass, that in various epochs divided and drifted apart. Those who do not subscribe to the theory of continental drift continue to explain the affinity of plants and animals by land bridges, or former land connections between continents, and also between continents and islands, in order that continents might move. It is claimed that there must be a basic difference between the composition of the Earth's crust, that is exposed in land masses, and that which exists at the bottom of the ocean. The theory of drifting continents is grounded on the increasingly well-proven doctrine of isostasy, or the flotation of the crust of the Earth on plastic magma. See there, the Earth loves plastic. I have a secret theory that the Earth created man to make plastic. I'm just kidding. A new nomenclature was introduced. The land masses, or the outer crust, are called silt, or sile, an abbreviation of silicon and aluminum, two of the elements predominant in the composition of terrestrial rocks. The substratum is called sima, an abbreviation of silicon and magnesium, sima, an abbreviation of silicon and magnesium. There being a good reason for believing that the rocks forming the substratum, bottom, of the ocean bed are more basic in composition and contain a large proportion of magnesium oxide. It is also assumed that the sima underlies the seal of the continents, and processing the plastic properties of sealing wax permits the continents to drift, besides accounting for the correspondence between the coastal features of eastern South America and western Africa, and between those of other continents, and certain affinities in the animal and plant kingdoms. The theory of drift tries to account for several geological phenomena, all in need of explanation. The cause of ice ages, 2, the distribution of coal beds, and 3, the formation of mountains. According to Wegener, mountainous crests rose in the movement of the land on the forward side of the floating continents, meeting some resistance in its motion on elastic sima, the seal, formed elevations. Thus, when South America moved away from Africa, an elevation was raised on the side turned to the Pacific Ocean, the Andes. If, from the beginning, there was one landmass, there could have been only one ocean too, and according to Wegener, the only ocean was the Pacific Ocean. The Atlantic is a later formation, and its bottom cannot be of sima like that of the Pacific, but is built of stretched seal. Sufficient proof of the difference in composition of the substratum of the Atlantic and the Pacific has not yet been adduced. The occurrence in an early glacial period of ice cover in lands now in tropical and subtropical regions is explained by the supposition that these lands were once in the Antarctic. However, their extent is so great that if all of them were joined around the South Pole, many parts that have signs of the Ice Age would still be too remote from the pole. The theory assumes, therefore, that these lands occupied in succession the position of the Antarctic continent today, each in its turn passing through a glacial period. The signs of glaciation in Africa, India, Australia, and South America are accounted for by the successive sliding of these continents through the southern polar region. A similar explanation is offered for the origin of the Ice Age in the northern hemisphere at a much more recent date, when the land masses of North America and Europe wandered close to the North Pole. The North Pole is charted on various points of the globe. In the Pacific, in the Canadian archipelago, in Greenland, and Spitsbergen, all in succession during the Pleistocene or recent Ice Age. The coal beds in northern countries, among them Alaska and Spitsbergen, are dated by Wegener from the time when these lands occupied tropical or subtropical belts on their passage from southern hemisphere to northern. The Columbia Plateau. Great quantities of lava flowed out in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, where some 200,000 square miles were covered to depths of hundreds and even several thousand feet. The Snake River has cut the Seven Devils Canyon more than 3,000 feet deep without reaching the bottom of the lavas. The enormous area embracing all the northern states between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific coast, was flooded with molten rock and metal pouring out of fissures torn in the ground. Certainly it does not look like a volcanic eruption of our days, and for this reason alone, if not for a multitude of others, the principle of uniformity is definitely misleading. The depth of lava of this vast Columbia Plateau is as great as 5,000 feet or more, even on the supposition that it was ejected in paroxysms, each time spreading a sheet only 75 feet thick. It is still enormous, and then such an injection must have been repeated as much as 70 times in the Cenozoic age, the age of mammals and man. And here is a striking thing. Striking because we are too readily disposed to consider that we have solved a problem when we remove it to the remote past. All competent observers have remarked the freshness of lava deposits in the Snake River Valley in Idaho. Only a few thousand years ago, lava flowed there, over an area larger than France, Switzerland, and Belgium combined. It flowed not as a creek, not as a river, not even as an overflowing stream, but as a flood, deluging horizon after horizon, filling all the valleys, devouring all the forests and habitations, steaming large lakes out of existence, as though they were little potholes filled with water, swelling even higher and overtopping mountains, and burying them deep beneath molten stone, boiling and bubbling, thousands of feet thick, billions of tons heavy. In 1889, on the occasion of the boring of an artesian well at Nampa, Idaho, on the Columbia Plateau near the Snake River, a small figurine of baked clay was extracted through a depth of 320 feet, penetrated after piercing a sheet of basalt lava 15 feet thick. G.F. Wright described the find and wrote, "The well was tubed with heavy iron tubing, 6 inches in diameter, so that there could be no mistake about the occurrence of the image at the depth stated." He also added, "No one has come forward to challenge the evidence except on purely a priori grounds arising from preconceived opinions of the extreme antiquity of the deposits. Before the last lava sheet spread over the Columbia Plateau, there were human abodes in the area." A continent torn apart. Africa was in tension and torn by north and south fractures, which, along with the sinking of a strip of crust, formed the longest meridional land valley on Earth. From Lebanon and Syria, then almost to the Cape, there runs a deep and comparatively narrow valley, margined by almost vertical sides and accompanied by the sea, by salt steppes and old lake basins, and by a series of over 20 lakes, of which only one has an outlet to the sea. This is a condition of things absolutely unlike anything else on the surface of the earth. The author of these lines, J. W. Gregory, the famous explorer of the great American rift, adopted the view that a general common cause created the entire rift, from its north to its south end. The rift begins in the valley of the Orontes River in Syria at Baalbek. It goes over to the Litani River Valley, then to Lake Hula in Palestine, along the Jordan River to the Sea of Galilee, called also Gennesaret, or the Sea of Tiberias, which lies in a depression below the level of the Mediterranean, from there to the Dead Sea, the deepest depression on earth, between the Judean and the Moabite mountainous plateaus that were torn apart, then along the Arabia Valley to the Gulf of Aqaba in the Red Sea, and across the channel of this sea into Africa. Thence, for an enormous distance, to the Sabi River in the Transvaal, branching on the way eastward to the Gulf of Aden and westward to Tanganyika and the Upper Nile, and the rift valleys of lakes Maurice and Upemba in the central Congo, all the way from 36 degrees north latitude in Syria to about 28 degrees latitude in East Africa, in a sinuous line along the meridian for more than a third of the way from one pole to another. It was recognized that a horizontal force of one kind or another that had been the cause of this rift valley. The simplest and earliest thought was that Africa had been pulled apart. However, another school of geologists questioned whether the rift could not have been produced under horizontal pressure, which forced the margins of the rift valley up and the valley stripped down. After a long debate, the consensus restated the view expressed by Edward Seuss, a prominent geologist at the turn of the century. The opening of fissures of such magnitude can be explained only by the action of a tension directed perpendicularly to the trend of the split, the tension being relieved in the instant of bursting, that is, of opening of the fissure. He observed also that immense floods of lava gushed out of the earth along the rift, and most vigorous volcanic action took place. Seuss brought to geology the now generally accepted concept of Gondwana land, a continental mass that occupied the larger portion of the Indian Ocean, and that in a relatively recent subsidence was torn apart and drowned. The subsidence of the Gondwana continent could have caused a strain on Western Asia and Africa, and under this tension the land must have been rent and the great rift formed. Gregory wrote, "The nearest approach in size to the rift can probably be found on the moon, whose clefts, or hills, no doubt represent long, steeply walled valleys, and present to us much the same aspects as this East African valley would, due to any inhabitants of our satellite." Not the least interesting of the points raised by the African Red Sea Jordan depression is the possibility that it may explain the nature of those lunar clefts which have so long been a puzzle to astronomers. The rift was produced by tension, hence the rifts on the moon were also caused by tension. Gregory followed Seuss in linking the Great Rift Valley with the mountain chains, the last great uplift of fold mountains in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Thus, the time of the last uplift, if established, would also clarify the time when Africa suffered the Great Rift. It is probable, too, that the rift began in one great tension and increased in the next. Gregory concluded, this widespread valley system is obviously not the result of some local fracture. Its length is about 1/6 the circumference of the earth. It must have some worldwide cause. The first promising clue to which is the date of its formation. The mountain ridge on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean may have been produced by the same cause, and the time of the rupture and faulting must have been coincident with one of the periods of mountain formation in Europe and Asia. Those mountains obtained their present height in the age of man. The rift, it is assumed today, was also created largely in the age of man, at the end of the Ice Age. What kind of force is necessary to tear apart a continent? Whence came the tension that was relieved by the bursting of the African landmass? Ice did not do it, nor the wind that erodes mountain heights, nor the rivulets that carry eroded detritus down to the sea. End of chapter. In 1952, author, polymath extraordinaire Immanuel Velikovsky authored and published Earth in Upheaval. After reading most of this book, somehow I have a hard time getting over the fact that the book is older than I am, but it's still current. I don't know if that speaks to Velikovsky's brilliance or the uniform lameness of academia. To think that they have not added anything major to any of their paradigms since the 19th century is astounding to me. It's mind-blowing. It's mind-boggling that they haven't learned anything. We've been stymied for over 100 years because they don't know anything more than they knew then, except for a couple more people who've stood on top of Mount Everest. That's pretty sad. What Immanuel Velikovsky has laid out here, without even really mentioning it, because I noticed that he purposely stays away from talking about what other planet or Mars or Venus. He doesn't mention any of them as of yet, and he just lays out undeniable evidence that in order for something to have done what it did to the Earth, it had to be an outside force, an extraterrestrial force that was being put on the Earth. Nothing that comes from inside it or from it could cause that kind of damage. And basically, that was either Venus or Mars or both. That's what I get from it. It's pretty overwhelming. Everywhere you look, there is what Buzz Aldrin called magnificent desolation. That's why I don't think there's going to be a pull flip. If I got Velikovsky on my side, I feel pretty good about that. I have fought YouTube Studio tooth and nail ever since it first started coming out, but I've been kind of getting into it a little bit lately, and I noticed that it gives me recent subscribers. I never even noticed that before, but on here is the last 3 subscribers. So if I think of it after I make a video, I'm gonna go on here and see who the last 3 subscribers were and give them a mention. So I give a shout out to WSO, Conscious Energies, and TARS 676. Thank you for joining. I am honored and welcome. Until next time, I'll see you. Take care.